He already knows what you're going to do. He knew before you were born, before your parents were born, before the first word of any scripture was written. He knew every choice you would ever make, every failure you would accumulate, every sin you would commit in secret, and every prayer you would whisper at 3 a.m. when you thought no one was listening. He knew. So why does he test you? That question has been haunting theologians for 2,000 years. But what's strange, what nobody talks about, is that the more you push on the answer, the more the entire foundation of faith begins to shake. Not because the answer is missing, but because the answer might be something none of us are prepared to accept. On the surface, this seems simple. God tests us to build our character, to strengthen our faith, to separate the sincere from the hypocrites. Every Sunday school teacher, every imam, every rabbi will give you some version of that answer. And it sounds perfectly reasonable. It sounds true, but here's the problem. If God already knows the outcome, if He has always known, then the test isn't testing anything. It's theater. It's a performance of a play where He wrote every line, already read every review, and knows exactly how it ends before the curtain rises. And if that's true, then what you thought was a test of your soul might be something else entirely. Something we'll come back to. Let's start with what we know, what the tradition actually says. In Genesis, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham prepares to comply. At the last moment, God stops him, provides a ram instead, and declares, "Now I know that you fear God." Now I know, that's the text. That's what it says, and theologians have spent centuries trying to explain why an omniscient God, a being outside of time, who fashioned reality itself, would use the phrase "now I know" as if He had just discovered something. The dominant answer has been this. God already knew the outcome. The test was never for God's information. The test was for Abraham. The ordeal forced Abraham to confront his own faith, to externalize an internal loyalty, to make his devotion real in a way that private belief never could. That's the official account, and it's compelling. The book of Job tells a similar story, though far darker. God permits Satan to destroy a righteous man's life entirely. Children killed, wealth stripped, body covered in sores. Job protests. He demands an explanation. And God's response is not comfort. And it is not apology. It is a question back. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? The test, apparently, is not about fairness, but there's something in the book of Job that almost nobody reads closely, and it changes everything. Before Satan destroys Job's life, God initiates the conversation. God points to Job first. Read it carefully. God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" God brings Job to Satan's attention. God is the one who opens the door, which means the suffering that follows. The dead children, the ruined crops, the diseased skin. God didn't just permit it, He suggested it. Now sit with that for a moment. The man being tested didn't volunteer. The man being tested didn't know he was being tested. And the one who initiated the test knew, with absolute certainty, how it would end. So what is actually happening here? There's an ancient argument, one most people have never encountered, that suggests the purpose of the test was never what we've been told. The argument comes from inside the tradition itself, and it begins with a word that has been quietly mistranslated for centuries. We'll come back to that word. If you're good, why is goodness not enough? If you're faithful, why does faith not protect you? If God knows the end from the beginning, why are you required to suffer the middle? That question doesn't just live in theology. It lives in psychology. It lives in the way we make decisions under uncertainty, the way we calculate risk, the way we assign meaning to suffering after the fact. There's a term in behavioral economics called outcome bias, the tendency to judge the quality of a decision by its result, rather than by the information available at the time the decision was made. We do this constantly. And the strange thing, the disturbing thing, is that God, by most theological accounts, has no outcome bias. He doesn't need to wait for results. He processes all information simultaneously outside of time, with perfect clarity, which returns us to the original problem. If perfect knowledge and the requirement to test cannot coexist, then one of them has to give way. Here is the argument that defenders of divine testing have made in its strongest form. God's omniscience doesn't remove human agency. It observes it. There's a difference, a crucial difference between knowing what will happen and causing what will happen. Think of it this way. If you read a history book, you know how every battle in it ended. That knowledge doesn't make you responsible for the battles. It doesn't make the soldiers any less real, their choices any less genuine. You're an observer of events, not their author. The theological term for God's relationship to time is eternal present. God doesn't see the future the way you see tomorrow. As something approaching, God sees all moments simultaneously, the way you can see an entire painting at once, while the subjects within it can only move in one direction through the scene. Under this framework, the test is not a performance. It is a genuine event, genuinely chosen by the person being tested, in real time, with real stakes. God's foreknowledge doesn't compress that event into meaninglessness. It witnesses it from outside the dimension where time moves at all. Abraham's hand on the knife is real. The trembling is real. The choice is real. God knew he would stop. Abraham didn't. And that gap, the gap between what God knew and what Abraham didn't, is where faith lives. That gap is where moral character is forged. Not for God's benefit, but for Abraham's. Not to inform the omniscient, but to transform the tested. The test on this reading is an act of generosity. Not punishment, not theater, but a gift wrapped in suffering. Designed to produce something in you that comfort never could. That's the strongest case, and it is genuinely compelling, but it has a fault line. The fault line is this: if God is truly omnipotent, not just all-knowing, but all-powerful, capable of any action whatsoever, then he could produce the same result without the suffering. He could strengthen Abraham's faith without the knife. He could reveal Job's righteousness without the dead children. The suffering wasn't logistically necessary, it was chosen. And now we're no longer asking why God tests us if he already knows the answer. Now we're asking something harder. Why does God require suffering to achieve ends he could achieve without it? The skeptic's answer is brutal in its simplicity. Because the texts were written by human beings who lived in worlds where suffering was unavoidable, and they needed a framework to make it meaningful. The God of the Bible on this reading is not omniscient. He is a projection of human psychology. Anxious, jealous, occasionally merciful, prone to testing his subordinates. Because that is what powerful men in ancient hierarchies did. This is not a fringe position. It is the majority position in academic biblical scholarship. The development of God's character across the Hebrew Bible, the contradictions between the God who commands genocide and the God who weeps for his people. These are not, the skeptics argue, the attributes of a coherent infinite being. They are the fingerprints of many human authors, writing across centuries for different political purposes. And the word that was quietly mistranslated, the one we've been waiting to address, appears right at the center of this debate. In Genesis 22, the word used for test in the Hebrew is nissa, from the root nasa. And in the oldest scholarly interpretations, this word does not exclusively mean to test in the sense of an examination. It also carries the meaning to experience or even to demonstrate. To demonstrate, not to discover, not to learn, but to make visible what already exists. Under this reading, God doesn't test Abraham to find out if Abraham is faithful. God tests Abraham to make Abraham's faithfulness visible to Abraham himself, and perhaps to the watching world. The test is not an investigation. The test is a revelation. That shift, from examination to revelation, changes everything about how you read these stories. Job is not being evaluated. Job is being revealed. The suffering strips away every external support, wealth, family, health, status, until what remains is either faith or nothing. And what remains in Job is faith. Not comfortable faith, not institutional faith, but something ragged and furious and real. God doesn't learn this about Job. God shows Job this about Job, and there is something in that idea, something genuinely strange and worth staying with, because it suggests that we don't fully know ourselves until we are tested. That the person you are in comfort and safety is not the whole person. That there is a version of you that only exists under pressure. And that version has never introduced itself. So now we have two arguments, and they cannot fully defeat each other. The skeptic says, an omniscient God who requires suffering to achieve ends he could achieve without suffering is either not omnipotent, not benevolent, or not real. The tests in Scripture reveal a God who is limited, inconsistent, and suspiciously human in his needs. The paradox isn't a paradox, it's evidence. The believer says the tests are not for God's benefit. They are for ours. God's foreknowledge doesn't make our choices less real, it witnesses them from outside time. The suffering is not arbitrary cruelty, but the precise mechanism by which something in us is forged that could not be forged any other way. Both arguments are coherent. Both arguments are incomplete. The skeptic cannot account for the consistent phenomenology of transformation that survivors of suffering describe. The specific quality of meaning that emerges from trial and not from ease. The believer cannot account for why a truly omnipotent God would design a reality where only suffering produces certain results. Both are left standing in the same place, which is, we do not know what consciousness is. We do not know what suffering is for at the deepest level. And any framework we construct to explain those two facts is going to be haunted by what it cannot reach. Here is what we are left with. If you are being tested, if something in your life right now feels like it is pushing against you without reason, without mercy, without apparent purpose, there are two ways to hold that experience. One, the suffering is noise, random. The byproduct of a universe that has no author and no intention. Your desire to find meaning in it is a psychological mechanism, an evolutionary artifact that helped your ancestors survive by creating patterns where none exist. Two, the suffering is signal, not evidence of punishment, not proof of abandonment, but the specific instrument through which something in you is being made visible, even to yourself. That had never been visible before. The paradox does not resolve. What God knows and what you don't know may be permanently separated by the dimension you inhabit, and He does not. But consider what the test actually demands of you. Not certainty, not proof, not a resolved theological argument. It demands that you act, that you move forward, hand trembling, in the absence of certainty, with no guarantee of outcome. And if that is the mechanism by which something real is forged in a human soul, then maybe the question isn't why an all-knowing God would test you. Maybe the question is, what would you be? What would any of us be without the knife?